Good evening. Today, my fellow senators and I are introducing the Taylor Force Martyr Payment Prevention Act. This bill is named after Taylor Force, who was killed in a Hamas stabbing spree while studying abroad in Tel Aviv in 2016. Taylor was a West Point graduate and an Army veteran who was studying for his MBA. Terrorism took this fine young man and his future from our nation. Instead of condemning this wanton slaughter, the Palestinian Authority sent money to the murderer's family. This is part of a grotesque trend in which the Palestinian Authority spends hundreds of millions of dollars a year on so-called martyrs' payments to the families of the dead or imprisoned terrorists. In honor of Taylor, Congress passed the Taylor Force Act in 2018, which restricted non-humanitarian U.S. aid to the Palestinian Authority until it ends what should more appropriately be called its pay-to-slay program. This legislation has made a difference, but our work is not yet finished. Reporting has revealed that foreign banks in the Middle East and the Mediterranean continue to process these so-called martyr payments. They have escaped sanctions by avoiding an official U.S. presence while maintaining correspondent accounts in the United States. That's why I'm honored to be here today with Taylor Force's parents as we introduce legislation, along with more than a dozen of my colleagues, that will hold these institutions accountable. The Taylor Force Martyr Payment Prevention Act would give the Treasury Department the ability to designate these banks as institutions of primary money laundering concern and forbid them from using correspondent accounts in the United States. Radical Islamic terrorists, like the one who killed Taylor Force, will not be rewarded in heaven. It should not be rewarded on earth. In memory of Taylor and so many other Americans who have been killed or wounded by terrorists, I call upon Congress to join my colleagues and I and pass this bill. I will now introduce Stuart and Robbie Force, Taylor Force's parents.
Robbie and I would like to thank Senator Cotton and co-sponsors for their friendship and leadership. In the years since our son Taylor was killed in 2016, we have been dedicated to making certain that at least some good emerges from our loss. Our first mission was the enactment of the Taylor Force Act 2018, which limits the U.S. aid to the Palestinian Authority while it continues its reprehensible pay-to-slay program of compensating terrorists and their families. Senator Graham, you gave us a mission and guidance in a time that was sorely needed for us. Thank you. We've recently come to the realization that the job is half done, and the truth is the payments have continued and those responsible have not been held accountable. The Taylor Force Martyr Payment Prevention Act seeks to finish the job by providing the U.S. government with an important new tool to disincentivize banks from being part of the martyr payment program and to deny them access to the U.S. financial system until they stop doing it. Speaking from personal experience, we can tell you this is not a theoretical problem. The family of the Hamas terrorist who murdered Taylor, celebrated as a hero by Hamas, has been receiving martyr payments as a reward for his despicable act. According to complaints that have been filed in federal court prior to Taylor's murder, Israel banned a group called Qatar Charity from operating in the Palestinian territories because it was diverting charitable funding to martyr payments. Nevertheless, it circumvented the ban with the help of Qatari bank Masraf al-Rayan, which moved millions of dollars through New York in part to fund martyr payments. Qatar National Bank provides banking services for Hamas leadership and terrorists such as Aham Tamimi, who is on the FBI's most wanted list and who orchestrated the 2001 Sbarro pizza bombing that killed 15 people. When we see something as egregious as a foreign bank assisting one of FBI's most wanted terrorists while also making full use of the U.S. financial system, We know we have found a loophole that needs to be changed. Passage of this bill wouldn't affect any pending legal actions, but it would hopefully prevent similar conduct in the future. No foreign bank, even one from friendly country like Qatar, which participates in rewarding those who kill innocent Americans like Taylor, should be able to evade responsibility. We want to send thanks again to Senator Cotton and his co-sponsors of the bill for their leadership and helping us to ensure that Taylor did not die in vain. Our mission continues. Thank you.
I'll now introduce Senator Lindsey Graham, a driving force in the original Taylor Force Act.
To Stuart and Robbie, it's good to see you again. You've left South Carolina to go to Austin, Texas to be near the grandbaby. I completely get that. You're in good hands with Ted. Tom, thanks. Thanks for taking up the cause. And Ted and Steve, thanks for jumping on early. This will pass. It's going to become law. I'd hate to be the person that said no. The problem is real. So real quickly, this journey began after your son was killed. I was contacted by you and some other folks, and it was hard to absorb really what you were talking about until I saw a video. Bashir Masala, I think, is the terrorist that killed your son. Now, this is not Hamas. This is the PA. Go on the internet, and you can see the hero's welcome this man received after he was killed by Israeli security forces. The man that murdered their son, who was a West Point graduate, went to Iraq and Afghanistan, studying in Israel, a master's program of global entrepreneurship, was out having dinner with some colleagues and just got killed for no reason at all, other than a terrorist wanted to make a point. And instead of condemning this act, the body was received in Ramallah by the PA as a hero, and the family was given a lot of money. So what we did is we said, any money the American government gives the Palestinian Authority, if a dime of it is spent to make martyr payments, we're going to cut all your money off. And that worked. That was a shot across their bow. But Tom and others have found out that banks and the private side of the equation are basically doing the same thing. So to those banks playing this game, your time is up. Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, it's hard to find bipartisanship these contentious times, but your son's death brought us together once. It will bring us together again, and we're going to hound these people until this dastardly practice of rewarding people for killing the innocent ends. There's nothing more inconsistent with peace than paying somebody to murder an innocent person.
We live in a dangerous world. We live in a world where evil exists. Anytime an American life is lost, we grieve the loss of that life. But there are times when a life is lost through an accident, through something that was not intended, and then there are times when an American is murdered. And even worse, when a governmental entity is actively and aggressively incentivizing that murder. Taylor Force was a fellow Texan. He grew up in Lubbock, Texas. He was a West Point graduate. And in 2016 in Tel Aviv, he was murdered by a 22-year-old Palestinian terrorist. This wasn't just a random act of street crime, but it was deliberate terrorism targeting an American. And as Lindsey described, the Palestinian Authority didn't treat this as a criminal act. They didn't treat it as the heinous act that it was. They treated it as something to be celebrated and, in fact, to be paid for. The Palestinian Authority's Martyrs Fund every year pays the family of terrorists who target and murder Americans and murder our allies. To put in perspective just how big this fund is, there are over 500 Palestinian bureaucrats who are responsible for getting $350 million a year to the families of terrorists. This is big business. Now, when Taylor was murdered, we saw Congress act. We saw Congress act in a bipartisan way, come together and say, Taylor will not have died in vain. We're going to change the policies. When the Taylor Force Act came into effect, though, the Palestinian Authority continued its reprehensible practices. And as a consequence, U.S. funding was cut off by the previous administration. Unfortunately, the Biden administration reversed that decision. One of the first decisions the Biden administration put into place was to open the spigots to send again hundreds of millions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority, even while they continue to pay the families of terrorists, even while they incentivize the murder of Americans. Now, I know the argument is, no, it comes from one account, not the other account, from the left hand and not the right hand. Money is fungible. And I'm going to suggest a very simple principle, which is we should not send 1 penny of federal taxpayer money to any organization that is celebrating, that is rewarding, that is incentivizing, that is causing American citizens to be murdered. Stuart and Robbie, thank you for your courage. Thank you for taking the unimaginable grief you've endured and turning it into fighting to change policy. Nothing we do here will bring Taylor back. But what we do here may stop the next young man, the next young woman in the Middle East from being murdered because of American policy that sends hundreds of millions of dollars to a governmental organization that is funding and incentivizing that murder. It is indefensible that a penny of U.S. taxpayer dollars should go to fund this murder. And I'm proud to stand with Tom. Thank you for your leadership. Lindsay, thank you for your leadership. Steve, thank you for yours. I'm proud to stand with my colleagues to stand united in saying we are going to protect American citizens abroad, and we should stop the horrific policies that incentivize their murder and terrorists. Steve Davis.
We live increasingly in a world that seems to blur good and evil. And perhaps what's being discussed today will bring some moral clarity to the forces of good and of evil. And the forces of good, I think that Stuart and Robbie celebrated the birth of a new grandbaby on Thanksgiving Day, new life. The forces of good, it was 4 years ago today that President Trump authorized that the U.S. Embassy be moved to Jerusalem. But we look at the forces of evil, the dark forces of evil, and to think that these martyrs, so-called by the Palestinian Authority, are being glorified for acts of terror. My sweet wife Cindy and I remember clearly a day a few years ago when we were walking in Bethlehem. And we've been in Nativity Square, a picture of good in this world. And we're walking back to the bus, and we saw posters on a community bulletin board of these terrorists who had committed horrendous terror acts and suicide bombing missions, glorified as heroes. To see that firsthand was a chilling moment for my wife and myself. But to think that these terrorists are not only being idolized, but also being paid, and paid significant sums of money to commit these horrendous acts of terror. It's time to close these loopholes. I want to thank the leadership, Senator Cotton, getting this bill moving forward, and Lindsay, what you have done to get this process going forward here. It's time to close the loopholes and strengthen the Taylor Force Act, so not another penny goes to these terrorists for committing this horrendous acts.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, most importantly, to Stuart and Robbie for once again lending the name of your heroic son to this legislative effort to ensure that the families of terrorists or terrorists sitting in prison are not being supported by U.S. dollars. We'll now open the floor to questions. Should anyone have questions about the legislation? Yes.
Thank you, Senator. Mark Rodgers, Jewish Insider. I know the original Taylor Force Act ended up having a number of Democratic responses. I see, based on the sheet your folks handed out, looks like it's just Republicans co-sponsoring the bill at this point. Do you see, room for Democratic responses, maybe less interest from Democrats? And number two, how do you sort of view the chances of this legislation getting passed this session?
Yes, I do. We have had conversations with a number of Democrats. I would point out the original Taylor Force Act did not have many Democratic co-sponsors at the beginning, but as more Democrats learned about the heinous practice that took Taylor Force's life, we joined in a bipartisan way to pass that legislation in 2018. I suspect that'll be the case in this iteration of the latest Taylor Force Act. I don't know if it will pass in this Congress, but I'm confident we will pass it. It's the kind of thing that most Americans would be shocked to know is happening with U.S. dollars. Payments going to support terrorists or their families for having murdered Americans or Israelis or other Westerners or any innocent civilian in the Middle East. Other questions? If there are none, we thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Lindsay and Steve and Ted, who are just one example of more than a dozen co-sponsors we have. And again, most importantly, thank you again to Stuart and Robbie for joining us in this effort to help protect Americans. Thank you.
Just nice to see you. Thank you so much. Thank you. This means a lot. Thank you so much.
Fellow grandparent,
so much.
thank you.
Thank you.
All right, sweetheart, enjoy the grandbaby. Yeah, yeah, I love you. Enjoy the grandbaby. We'll stay in touch.